And certainly for centuries, Norwegians have valued the beauty of silver and the jewelry they made from it, which was passed down and cherished for generations. Silver could show the prosperity of the family. It could also, according to folk belief, cure sickness in humans and animals, improve crops, protect against storms, and especially evil spirits. So men, women, and children wore some kind of silver jewelry basically every day. And part of that was functional. There weren't any other closures on the shirts and blouses, so you had to wear a collar pin just to keep yourself dressed. But on special occasions, or if you were from a wealthier family, you would certainly have more brooches and more elaborate brooches for special occasions. The photos and the artifacts that you'll be seeing today are from Vesterheim's collection, unless there's a small attribution on the photo. So it's an exciting opportunity to share with you some of our collection. And brooches are something that are a little hard to share in person to a large group. So this works quite well for us, I think. So very pleased to be with you. So we'll start with men. I don't talk about men's silver quite as much in this program, but men's silver could take the form of collar pins, uh, suit and trouser buckles and buttons, shoe buckles. Men also typically wore knives, and knives were certainly functional. They were often decorative, and there was also a power to knives. They were made of steel, which was almost as powerful as silver. Children also wore some silver, and it might be a pin on a shirt or a dress, just a little bit. And we'll talk about more why, but some very small pins that you might encounter were probably meant for children. Most Norwegian silver jewelry is made from an alloy containing 843, 830 parts of silver out of 1,000. So this is not quite sterling. It makes it a little bit stronger than sterling. Oslo was a silversmithing center, but certainly Bergen was known as the primary place that silver jewelry was made. It was made for local tastes, but made here for the rest of the country. It's a little confusing because the artists that worked in silver were called goldsmiths, but it was the goldsmiths that worked with the silver. There was a guild system in place starting in 1568 that was meant to provide some quality control and training for its members, but it was also meant to prohibit other artists from working. Most of the artists worked within the guild system, but there were certainly some that worked outside of it, especially in the most rural areas. And so sometimes you'll hear references to bonde smiths, farmer smiths, and they would be perhaps working in their farm home studios. Norwegian goldsmiths produced a wide variety of pieces using just a few techniques. One of the techniques was casting. So you would create the shape of the brooch or the decorations in a block of stone or clay or sand, and then pour in molten metal. So the example in the top left is a candlestick, but you could do anything with this of making a mold and making a casting. Another common decorative technique is chasing, and this is shaping the metal from the front, very often with these round tools to give you these little circles. You've seen this on the dangles on brooches, but it's also a key element to some of them, such as this one, where the hair on the faces is shaped from the front. There's another name for this technique if you work from the back, but it's the same idea of changing the shape of the metal with one of these tools. Engraving is an important design element. This is cutting into the metal with a sharp tool. And so when you see these either fine or bold lines, that's been cut in with a tool. Some of the Bergen goldsmiths were creating special patterns, special decorations, special pieces for different people in Norway who had kind of specific requests. And one of those were the Sami in the north of Norway, who especially liked larger brooches, gold plated pieces, And sometimes there are some particular pieces like this man's jacket closure that were specific to Sami land. Even though the smith was working in Bergen, there were other folks who wanted specific items. Certainly today, there are many gold and silversmiths working in the north, but in the past, it was often work being done in Bergen and sent north.
Excuse me, Laurann, are
Sure.
you sharing screen?
I thought so.
Because I don't see, are you referring to a PowerPoint?
Yeah,
Yes.
there's a presentation, Charlotte.
Can you tell me how I could see that?
Look up in speaker view in the.
Yep, I have that on.
I don't have another suggestion, unfortunately.
Yeah, because I think I see the whole screen.
Yeah.
Like a PowerPoint.
Yep.
Oh gosh, shoot. Okay, well I'm sorry I can't see that. Excuse me.
Well, then I can work with you, Charlotte, afterwards to be sure you can see the images because some of your pieces are in the presentation. So
Okay, thank you.
you could listen along today and then we'll be sure that you can get the images afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Even though there were some specific groups of people or specific areas in Norway that had certain style requests, one of the techniques that was done all across Norway, very popular, was filigree. And filigree involves taking wire, perhaps coiling it, twisting it, shaping it into a fine, lacy design. And this covers many of the brooches. The most magnificent example of filigree is the bolasolja, which was common in Telemark in the south. These are very large. Some of these are as much as 3.5 inches across. And it's called a bolasolja because there are actually little boxes or boler. And so some of these portions are raised just a little bit to look like a box. And this is a spectacular example. There are so many tiny elements, and these are done by hand. Each piece of wire is twisted or coiled and cut and shaped and added by hand. So even though these look quite amazing, they're even more incredible when you think that each element was done by hand. Filigree was a technique that came out of the Far East. It traveled across Europe and into Norway, arriving in about the 14th century, and it pretty much stayed. And especially rural Norwegians loved the filigree decorations, and so basically elevated this to an art form. Another filigree brooch is called the slangesolja, and this has loops. I guess if you imagined it a little bit like a snake, loops around a central ring, and these are decorated with different versions of filigree. This is a medieval brooch. It first appeared in the Middle Ages, as did this design, the rosasolja. And the rosasolja is a very common pattern. It's a flower brooch, and at first maybe you don't see quite how this works, but if you imagine that each of these kidney shapes that has backs to the center ring is a petal. So they're kidney shaped petals around a central ring, and sometimes there's an outer ring as well. And this is also a design that has been in use since the Middle Ages. Faces appear on some brooches, and faces have been a motif on storehouses since the Middle Ages, thought to offer some protection to the content. The piece on the left that is a simple circle with faces is a man's collar pin, and the one on the right is called a Vestlandssolja, or West Coast brooch. And this is a style that's much more recent than the others. I've been showing you a lot of designs that have been in use since the Middle Ages. The one on the right, the Vestlandssolja, was developed really in the 1800s by Bergen goldsmiths. And it does have faces. They're not always easy to see. On this example, which is one of yours, Charlotte, there are faces around the outer edge. And then one characteristic of this West Coast brooch is gold plating, even-sided crosses as dangles, and very often red glass or something a little bit similar to garnet added to it. So this is a more recent design specific to the west coast of Norway. The Hjertesolja is from eastern Norway, And heart-shaped brooches today are very, very popular. There is usually a heart, sometimes topped by a crown or sometimes topped by a pair of birds. They might be very large or small, but these are beautiful motifs that have come first from Eastern Norway. And small heart-shaped brooches were sometimes given from boys to their sweethearts. And these are quite popular, and we'll see a few more of these at the end today. Now, the way you would wear a brooch, and I'll go back just one slide, there's a prong in the center of many of the brooches I've been showing you. And that prong was originally the fastening device. So on the oldest brooches, the prong is loose. And it was meant that you would push up some fabric through the center, stab the fabric, and that would keep on your brooch. And so on this particular image on a woman from Telemark, she's wearing a slångesolje, and because we can't see that center, we know that there's some fabric there that's been attached by way of the prong. Well, the prong isn't the most easy system to use, and so it's really no surprise that starting in about the 1890s, the prong was left, but the fastening device was a modern pinback. And so brooches that you buy today, some of the styles will still have a prong. It's an important part of the history and identity of these brooches. And so even though it's not a functional element, it's really seen as a fairly critical design element. So for some of these styles like the rosasolje or the slångesolje, if you buy one today, there will be a prong, a non-functional prong on the center front. We've been looking at a lot of round brooches, but certainly there are other styles of jewelry and garment fasteners. And one of those is the collar button or halsknop. And there are many different forms of this. Some of them are much like a button or a cufflink with a sort of a post on the back. You would have a hole in the collar that those would go through. And then again today, some of these are made with a modern pin back, but still this idea of having something at the collar to fasten. Lots of dangles, as is traditional for many of the Norwegian pieces of jewelry. And we can take a closer look at some of those dangles, even-sided crosses, small filigree details, rings, those round bowls that are often called spoons are very, very common. We also see a lot of leaf shapes, so diamond shapes that are meant to look like a leaf. And that's a tie-in to the name of these. In Norwegian, any kind of dangle is called lauv or löv, and that means leaf. And sometimes there might be one dangle, sometimes the piece is completely covered. And in fact, some brooches are so covered with dangles that you really can't see what kind of brooch it is. So with a lot of them, I like to turn them over and take a look at the base just to get a sense of the type of brooch it is. So with this one, the ring designs so completely cover it that you don't see that this is a rosasolje with those kidney-shaped petals around a central ring. Now, the dangles are beautiful. They add a lot of flair to these pieces, but there's also a protective element. And if we go back in time, well before those years of mass immigration, we go back to a time when there was a different belief system. And if we study those beliefs, often carried down through folklore, we can understand a little bit more about some of the meanings behind these. And the rural Norwegians in the past believed that there were constant dangers. There were dangers from spirits of the dead. There were from the devil, supernatural creatures that inhabited rivers and waterfalls, and certainly a category of creature called a huldrefolk. The huldrefolk were probably the main reason many Norwegians wore silver in the early years. It was for protection from these things. It was believed that silver itself had a protective quality to it. And if you passed down these silver items, they would gain power. If you wore them into church, they gained power. And if you had dangles, it would add power by reflecting evil away from the wearer. Huldrefolk were considered hidden people or underworld creatures. They lived inside the hills and the mountains, and when they did choose to show themselves, they looked a lot like humans. So it was kind of a tricky situation. Holderfolk were intending to strengthen their gene pool, so they wanted to marry humans or steal babies, but by swapping them with one of their own. Of course, this sounds very superstitious to us today, but in the past, it was a way to explain the unexplainable. Again, we have to go many hundreds of years back in time to when this belief system was the strongest, but this helps us understand why you would have so many pieces of silver, so many dangling decorations, and part of it had to do with this protective element. So humans could protect themselves with the sign of the cross, fire, steel, like a knife, faces, and family silver. So we needed to wear silver every day, again, because it was functional, but also because you never knew when or where you would encounter these underworld creatures or other kinds of supernatural threats. There's one style of brooch that has a history that's very closely connected to the Holderfolk, and that's a brooch called a bighorn ring or a barley kernel ring. It's thought that these little tiny decorations look like barley kernels. It's said in the past that these brooches were too beautiful to have been made by human hands. These were surely made by Holderfolk. Well, I've just told you that humans were working very hard to avoid the Holderfolk. So how would you end up with a Holdra-made brooch? Well, we can look to folklore to give us a little bit of information. The information is captured in legends. Folk tales are told for fun, but legends were often told as truth. They were also containing prescriptive information, meaning what to do or else and why. And so if we look to the legends, they can kind of explain some of this context for us. So one of the legends that can be useful for us is one called the Interrupted Wedding. There are many variations of this one, and the version I'm going to share with you is from Eastern Norway. So Ellie Bakken was alone up in the summer mountain cabin when her sweetheart came in and said he wanted to get married right away. She saw the dog glaring and growling at him, and she started to get suspicious. Then a crowd of people came inside the cabin. Two sad-looking women stood a little apart from the others. "Your dog doesn't seem to like people," she said with a wink. "It might be best to let him out." Ellie understood that these people were really Holderfolk. She took the dog out to the edge of the woods, tied a ribbon around his neck, and sent him home. She wanted to go too, but she went back into the cabin to prepare for the wedding. As one of the women pinned a filigree brooch at her neck, she whispered, "Stay calm, help will come." Then Ellie remembered that 2 years ago, a couple women had disappeared from that very cabin, and she understood that it was those women that were trying to help her now, so she cooperated. Down at the home farm, Ellie's mother saw the dog racing up with the ribbon fluttering, and she knew that something was wrong in the mountain cabin. The dog came into the house and barked with all his might at the gun that was hanging on the wall. Ellie's father saddled his horse as fast as he could and rode up to the farm of Lars, Ellie's real sweetheart. When the two men arrived at the cabin, they saw a long row of saddled horses and looked inside to see the table set for a feast and a party, and Ellie dressed as a bride. The men fired a shot over the top of the cabin. "In Jesus' name," Ellie exclaimed and crossed her hands over her throat. The Holderfolk quickly tore off the rest of the bridal finery, but they could not take the big silver brooch because her hands were crossed over it. The Holderfolk rushed out of the door like balls of gray wool, and Ellie was saved. So just to back up a tiny bit to explain the story, the steel in the gun and the lead in the bullets being fired over the cabin helped break the spell. And one of those protective elements is the sign of the cross. So when Ellie had crossed her arms over the brooch, that kept it with her rather than being taken away by the Holderfolk. Underworld creatures were believed to take advantage of the situations when humans were alone and isolated, like when women were tending cows in the summer pastures or men were off hunting. Holidays such as Christmas and Easter were also considered dangerous because the spiritual doors would open and the supernatural beings would be let out. Rites of passage, especially baptism and marriage, were times when Huldrefolk commonly attacked because humans were vulnerable at that moment they went from one status to another. Until infants were baptized, they were in constant danger from Huldrefolk. Parents watched their babies carefully and often placed metal in the cradle until baptism could provide more permanent protection. The metal might be a brooch, but it might be a knife or it might be a pair of scissors. The thought of scissors or a knife in bed with a baby is sort of horrifying to us, but the supernatural threat to the child was very real to people in the past. And so it was important to take some of these precautions. Infants were considered heathen until they were baptized. So it was important that the ceremony, the christening ceremony, be held very quickly, ideally within a week or a week or two. The risk was strong for the child even during the christening ceremony because it was the Huldrefolk's last chance to swap the human baby with one of their own. It was considered important to take these precautions because it was difficult to get the babies back after they had been exchanged for the Huldre babies. Now, psychologically, this was probably a way to explain congenital abnormalities or childhood illnesses. The legends offer several solutions for getting the babies back. One mother feared that her baby had been traded for a Huldre baby called a changeling, even though she had taken precautions. She had put a beaver's castor gland into the cradle, made the sign of the cross over the baby, pinned a soya to his shirt, and placed a knife over the door. So finally, she asked the help of a Signa-Shadding, a woman she hoped could cure the child by supernatural means. By recording historical beliefs and meanings, legends can help us understand the social and cultural context that surrounded objects like silver and like clothing, because clothing offered much of the necessary protection during baptism. Garments were handed down and gained power each time they were worn in church. There might be metal lace on the little cap, or a brooch on the dress could show the Huldrefolk that the child had been claimed by the human world and also reflect away their evil. Cross symbols might be woven into designs on swaddling bands and colorful wool christening blankets. But when they were absent, something even as simple as a coin in a swaddling band or a straight pin on a cap could protect the child. In the mid-1800s, a pastor in a remote district of Telemark found a darning needle poking a baby in the scalp. He examined the child who had screamed all during the christening service. The baby's parents had stuck the needle into the cap for protection for the child, and it had come loose. The child was unharmed, but perhaps a little irritated during the service. And that was the mid-1800s. So a few of these belief systems did continue, but usually it was the objects that continued after the belief system had changed. Although marriage was a less dangerous time than baptism, men and especially women needed extra silver for protection. At the precise moment they went from single to married, they risked being taken into the mountain. To prevent this, some grooms wore a cross on a long chain, and brides in nearly every part of Norway wore some sort of special head covering, often a crown. The few crowns that existed in a church parish would be available for rent, perhaps from the pastor or maybe from the owner who was a wealthy farm owner. Many years in church would add power to these pieces, and the metal would help keep the wearer safe from becoming a Huldre bride or groom. Brides wore the most and the finest jewelry, including several large brooches, finger rings, and bridal necklaces. They wore religious medals, 17th and 18th century coins, or large lockets suspended from thick chains. So I'll just show you a few of the variations for the crowns. This is from Hardanger, and we have beadwork decoration, wool pom-poms, and lots of dangling ornaments, including coins and some of these cutout shapes that look like suns and starbursts for good luck. Not every part of Norway used a crown. In some parts of Norway, they used something called a lod, L-A-D, which is an older medieval style of headdress. And the way you can tell them apart, one way is, of course, the lod is not so vertical. But another way you can tell is with the lod, the decorations usually cover the surface almost completely. Usually you can't see much of any color at all. It's all beadwork or silver ornaments. And this is Voss. Here are some of those other pieces that the bride would wear. The bridal locket that might hold a little bit of money for the pastor. We also see religious medals and coins used as bridal pendants. By the mid-19th century, most Norwegians had stopped believing in Huldrefolk and felt they no longer needed silver for the purpose of protection. As fashionable European dress replaced rural folk dress, it eliminated the need for customary fasteners. The Norwegian soya and silver tradition is a living tradition. Although some styles have changed little over the last 500 years, there have been changes in technique, design, and function, which has kept alive our interest in the brooches. The tradition is alive and well in the United States as well, among the descendants of immigrants, who often brought brooches and sometimes even crowns as mementos, but also as portable wealth. And some continued to wear them. Norwegian women were eager to be American, and so they adopted American clothing. But it was not uncommon, especially in the years when a brooch was a fashion item, to wear one of their Norwegian brooches as a way to look up to date, but to show a little heritage as well. So the woman on the right was living in Fargo and wearing a very small brooch at the neck of her dress. So certainly today in communities settled by Norwegian immigrants, like the Twin Cities and Decorah, it's not uncommon to see a solja at the neck of a blouse or the lapel of a jacket. Although the older meaning behind the silver is not always known, silver remains powerful as a symbol of national pride and ethnic identity. Many people who have silver jewelry from Norway, either family pieces or pieces they've collected, even modern pieces, have a lot of questions about how best to care for them. So I want to share a little bit with you on how to care for your Norwegian silver jewelry. Probably the most important thing with the silver jewelry from Norway is do not use silver dip style cleaner. It cleans it too well. It's fine for your modern pieces, but Norwegian silver jewelry, as you've been perhaps seeing along the way, is that there are often areas that are oxidized, tarnished, but are left that way because it helps show off those fine details in the filigree. So you want some tarnish on your brooches. You don't want it completely gone. If you use silver dip, the pieces tend to look bleached out and really quite sad, in my opinion. So you want to clean it a little more gently so that you get off some of the tarnish, but not all of it. So what I recommend is that you mix up a solution, about a cup of warm water, about a teaspoon of ammonia, and just a couple drops of hand dishwashing liquid. Soak your brooch in that liquid for 15-20 minutes, and then you could rub it gently with an old toothbrush to help get some of the extra tarnish off and get in and amongst all of the elements. Once you're done with the toothbrush, rinse it very well and let it dry completely. Your more elaborate brooches might even need to dry overnight. There'll be so many little parts to it. Once it's completely dry, then I would recommend getting a silver polishing cloth. You can get these at jewelry stores, at Target, at Walmart. And this is a cloth that has in it just a little bit of light polishing material. Then you'll want to hold your brooch, support it very well, and then rub the high points with the cloth. It's going to have a lot of details, most likely. It's hard to get in and amongst things, and that's okay, because those lower areas are what need to hold the tarnish to show off the detail. So just hit the high areas. Especially with the spoons, I like to use a pencil eraser to help me get the cloth into the rounded parts, in between things. This just gives you a little bit of extra grip with the pencil eraser. With the dangling pieces, be extra careful. Many of these are attached with just a single small jump ring, and some of the filigree elements are very fragile, and you don't want to undo any of this to distort it. So just be very, very cautious and be sure that each piece is well supported with your hand as you're rubbing gently. The next step, once you've got it polished up, is to keep it clean. It's easier to keep it clean than to clean it. Another thing you should be aware of is that each time you clean jewelry, you remove just the tiniest layer of the metal surface. So over time, you can actually wear out your jewelry by cleaning it. So the less cleaning you have to do, the better, not only for your jewelry, but for you. So once it's clean, I recommend keeping it in either a zip top plastic bag, or if you have one of these hard plastic boxes, especially for the more modern pieces, this is a good way to keep out the air, because it's the chemicals in the air that cause the tarnish. And if we can keep the air out, we can keep the brooch looking better, even nicer. If you come away with this program remembering only two things, I hope it's that you don't use silver dip cleaner and you don't use rubber bands. Rubber bands are full of sulfur, and that's one of the chemicals that causes tarnish. If, for example, you have maybe a cardboard box with a rubber band around it, you won't be helping your jewelry out at all. You could cause extra tarnish, and it's possible even to end up with a line, a darker line on your piece where that rubber band was. So get rid of your rubber bands in your jewelry drawer or your box. And if you really need to keep something closed, just use some yarn or string or twine to keep it closed, and try to get rid of all of your rubber bands. And with these easy tips, they really are pretty easy. I hope you'll be able to not only enjoy your jewelry more, but wear it more often too. Well, Karin had given you the option of sending in some images for show and tell, and I'm so pleased that some of you chose to. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about these, and then certainly we can open this up and you can say more about your pieces if you'd like to. It would be great to hear from you directly. I'm going to start with Mary Jo Thorsheim's painting. This is a painting titled Baking Flatbread by Ivan Nielsen, a Norwegian artist. And not only is this charming and gives us a glimpse into everyday life in Norway, it's a wonderful reminder that women and men needed some sort of jewelry every day, even when they were working, just to keep dressed. And here we see a fairly small brooch at the neck of this woman who's baking flatbread. We don't see much detail, but it was part of the outfit, part of everyday life, even just a simple piece. The next ones I'm showing are from Charlotte Pratt Nordstrom. And what's wonderful about Charlotte's pieces is that there are some maker's marks on them. So we're going to explore that part of it. You saw both of these pieces earlier in the presentation, the Vestland Solja, the West Coast brooch. One thing that you often see with these West Coast brooches, say that 3 times fast, is that the element with the red glass or garnet stones is sometimes loose and set over the original fasteners. I think it was just a way to add a little more decoration to the piece. The bridal pendant, I think, has been altered at some point. It has what looks to me like a pocket watch fastener on it. So I think there was some damage to the original hanging device, probably here where we're missing a little piece. And many of the brooches that you see have dangles in odd numbers. Part of that is because it's more pleasing design-wise. The number 3 has a long history in Norway as representing the Christian Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And 3 is also goes back to pre-Christian times as being an important number for breaking spells. And so certainly having elements in 3, like 3 dangles, 3 dangles from each, has a very deeply rooted tradition in Norway. Even the back of this pendant is beautiful. It has some engraving in kind of a sun or a starburst pattern, and you might be able to see some little marks in the center. And we'll take a closer look at those. Those are maker's marks. Not every piece of Norwegian silver was marked. Certainly if you were working outside of the guild system as a goldsmith, you would not be marking. But even with the guild artists, they didn't always mark every piece. But when they did, we can learn a lot about it. So the first mark, it's a little mushed. I'm not sure why, if they had a bad stamp or what, but I think this first mark is the symbol for Bergen. Each city had its own mark, and so this indicates it's a city gate over 7 circles, and the 7 circles represent the 7 hills of Bergen. So this tells us the piece was made in Bergen. The next 2 stamps, I think, represent the assay master, Christian Hoff, who was active from 1821 to 1860. And the IR stands for goldsmith Jakob Raven, and he was alive from 1807 to 1857. Unfortunately, there isn't just one single resource for all of the silver marks in Norway, but there are volumes for each city. And so it's very often possible to track down who the goldsmiths were, when they were trained, when they were active, which gives us some clues about the pieces. The next 2 marks tell us exactly when this piece was made. The 10 is for the 10th month of October, and the single 2 digits of 4 and 2 represent the year it was made, 1842. Sometimes the year is stamped out completely, but more often it's just the last 2 numbers. And we don't know if that's 1742 or 1842 without some of those other clues. But knowing the dates of the assay master and the goldsmith, we know that this bridal pendant was made in 1842 in Bergen. A couple other examples of marks on silver. This is another piece from Charlotte, and this is a filigree brooch with lots of sort of lacy dangles. And on the back, we can see it marked K.A. Rasmussen, 13 1/4 Christiania. And that's even easier than tracking down those little symbols for the goldsmith. Carl Rasmussen was active from 1872 to about 1883 in the city that is now known as Oslo, Christiania. And the mark of 13 1/4 is another way to think about the purity of the metal. Before 1883, the purity stamp that was used on silver, if there was a stamp, was 13 1/3, 13 1/4, 13 1/2. And this means that many parts of silver out of 16. So again, this is Norwegian silver, not quite sterling. From 1883 on, the larger workshops started to stamp with 830 instead. So you can tell a little bit about the date of a piece by the nature of the stamp. And then after 1892, we see the stamp 830S. And we can see that on our next piece, which is Anne Sather's brooch. And it's a little hard to see. On the back, there's a teeny tiny flat section in the center back, and I tried to enlarge it for you. It says 830S, and that was the mark used after 1892. Another clue to the age of the brooch is the modern pin back versus one of those prong motifs. So we don't know when it was made, but it was made in or after 1892. Anne's piece here is her favorite Solja. She said she purchased it about 6 years ago from Daughters of Norway charter member Kelly Simons. Kelly had bought it on eBay for about $300 a few years earlier. The original owner's grandmother had brought it from Norway. And this one's a great one because it shows something that you don't always see on the Norwegian brooches, which is elements, decorative elements within the bowl-shaped dangles. So we don't have just plain bowl shapes, we have decorations within. If we look to the back of the piece, I think this is basically a rosasolia. Those kidney-shaped petals are rotated and then stretched out to look like hearts. But at its heart, I believe that's a rosasolia piece. So unfortunately, Anne, I can't tell you the date of it other than it's in or after 1892. After about 1900 or so, we start to see a real flowering and expansion of the goldsmithing tradition in Norway. So a lot of the brooches that I was showing in the main part of the presentation are the roots. And then after about 1900, we see things really explode in creativity. We don't see just those basic shapes anymore. We see those shapes expanded. So for example, this brooch on the right, which is one of Charlotte's, it's a rosasolia. We see those kidney-shaped petals, but instead of them being around a simple ring, they're around a large decorative element, this domed piece with filigree. And we also start to see different kinds of pieces, not just brooches, but bracelets, rings, earrings. We didn't see as much of those at all in the early years, but after about 1900, all of these beautiful decorative traditional elements become available and able for us to enjoy on a variety of objects. Then we get a little bit more recent and it gets even harder to figure out the date for some pieces. We have a piece from Susan Anderson and Ruth Dodson, and Susan's was found in a consignment store in Arizona just a few years ago. And Ruth's came through her family, from her grandmother to her mother to her. Once we get after about 1900, we don't have as many clues. You might have a maker's mark that would allow you to track down a maker and the years something was made, but it gets a lot trickier. So the best I can do with these two pieces is to say that they were made after about 1900. Another clue to the after 1900, the fact that there aren't the usual or aren't some marks to use, is that after 1900, we really see a lot of these very delicate, frothy, lacy dangles made out of the twisted wire. We saw a few of those on the very old pieces, but not so many. And this has to do with technological advances and the ability to make some of these a bit more quickly. I won't say mass produced, it's not quite that level, but more easily and more quickly. So these lacier brooches have been happening since about 1900. Another thing that helps us date this a little bit is after 1900 are these diamond shaped dangles. The oldest ones had the shaping done to them by hand, but after 1900, there's a little bit of a shortcut taken when these are stamped. And so these much more uniformly decorated ones are a clue that it's more recent, as well as these teardrop shapes, which we don't see as often on the oldest brooches, but increasingly after about 1900. But beautiful pieces, and how fun to have something that you found, and even better that you've inherited. So at this point, Karin, I think this would be a great time for either some of these show and tell artists to talk about the pieces, or if there are questions or other Solia stories to share.
Great. There are no questions in the chat.
Okay.
I think that's the easiest way to ask questions, unless, as Laurann mentioned, any of you would like to share a story about your Solia. I'm going to go to gallery view. Otherwise, I think you have our heads spinning, Laurann.
It was a lot all at once, I admit.
Well, that's why I love having you speak, because it's always more than what is expected, which is a great thing for a speaker. But maybe if you have a question or a comment, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you and unmute. Otherwise, maybe, Laurann, is it asking too much to put your email in the chat, and
Sure.
people can email you when they go to their dresser and dig out their piece?
Absolutely. Molly, could you put that in the chat for me? Molly is putting in a few things into chat too about our website. If you go to the museum website, there's a chance to see some additional pieces of silver. We have a virtual gallery, and you can go and see some beautiful silver pieces from the collection. You can also check our folk art listings for different kinds of programs coming up. We have had some Solje earring classes and some other silver classes that you might like to take part in. And as Karin mentioned, please do feel free to contact me later if you would like information about something you have, or if I passed too quickly through some of my topics today. Those of you who had sent me photos ahead of time, you sent amazing photos. Thank you. It was great to get in to really look closely at some of those elements, and that certainly helps me out to help you know a little bit more.
Mary Jo had her hand up.
I think Linda was before me, but
Go ahead. Go ahead,
shall I go ahead? Okay.
please.
I wondered about the source of silver, if we know. Was the ore mined in Norway and maybe near Bergen? Did that maybe promote the craftsmanship there? I don't know if that's known. And I never thought of it until your fascinating program. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Mary Jo. That's a great question, and I should have touched on that. Norway is one of the few places in Europe that has silver naturally found, and the largest deposits are in the south near Kongsberg. And I believe that silver had been found in other places in Norway in very small amounts. And so it could be that that's part of the reason silver is so well established in Norway as the most valuable metal. In terms of its historical and cultural value, it has a higher value than gold. And I think it's because silver was found in the country, and the mines are near Kongsberg. I don't think they're mining them anymore, but if you were traveling in Norway, you could take a mine tour. And then because Kongsberg was a wealthier city because of the mine, there are some fabulous things to see there that are, for example, the church in Kongsberg is really fascinating to see. It's not like other churches in Norway. So you can add that to your to-do list the next time you're traveling.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you. Linda?
Well, I think the presentation was wonderful, and I so enjoyed the behind the scenes tour that Steve and I took. Well, it's been over 10 years ago now, because we purchased it for the silent auction at our institution, and that's when I first really got to have this wonderful tour with Laurann behind the scenes, and it's just amazing. But I didn't have the opportunity to send you a picture, but I have besides my Vasa jewelry that I acquired in more recent years. Steve, my sweetheart, gave me this, the heart with the crown on it, and he found it on eBay, and it came from England. So somehow it ended up in England. So that's my little story. And I've never really looked at markings before, but it does have that 830 on the back, and probably something else too. I'll have to get a magnifying glass out. You know, it's more modern with the modern clasp and everything, and the teardrop.
How beautiful. And what a great story behind it. You know, I
Yeah,
think a lot
it's
of
kinda
us
fun.
would prefer these newer, lighter weight styles. Some of those old ones are so heavy that they don't, they're not as easy to wear with our clothing today. You really have to have the support of the bunad to wear some of those huge ones. But these lighter weight, frothy, lacy, beautiful ones are a little easier for all of us to get to wear more often. Thanks, Linda. Great to see you
Thank
again.
you.
I have a question about the Swedish ones. I thought that they were the ones that had the crown on the top. Is that true?
I think there are some Swedish styles with crowns on the top.
But
Otherwise, are they similar to Norway's or?
Some similarities and some differences. I think one characteristic that makes the silver or the Swedish jewelry a little different is that it seems like many of the shapes are left more plain. So for example, there's a ring-shaped brooch used in Dalarna, and it's just a smooth ring, where the Norwegians would tend to have a lot of texture in that ring with cutouts or engraving or other small details. So I think that many of the forms are very similar, but the Swedish styles tend to be much smoother and higher polish And that's a broad generalization, but there are some wonderful silver traditions in Sweden as well, especially in the south in Skåne. Some really wonderful things.
Okay.
Lauren, do you see that some people are raising their hands? Can you see that on the gallery view? So
Well,
like
there's-
Signe and Ruth are waiting.
Oh, okay. So let's do Ruth.
Yeah,
And-
I'm just wondering, as we shop or look at eBay or whatever, has there been like a mass market or like a cheap market of them that we should watch for, that we aren't paying hundreds of dollars for some two-bit ripoff kind of a Stolia? Is there something, or is it all pretty much what we find is going to be real silver jewelry?
That's a very good question. I think that mostly you will find things that are silver. The one thing to watch out for, I think, is that the histories of the pieces have been exaggerated, in my opinion. So sometimes when you go to eBay, they will list every brooch with dangles or every brooch with a heart as a wedding solia. And so I think when they describe it that way, the price tends to go up. And it certainly could be that that individual piece was a wedding gift to a bride or worn in a wedding, but not all heart-shaped brooches were associated with weddings, and not every brooch with dangles was associated with a wedding. So that would be my one caution, is that if you like the piece, if you think it's in good condition and something you'd like to wear, go for it. But I think be just a little cautious of what other claims are made about it, because it may not have been, it's not necessarily a wedding brooch because it's a heart or has dangles.
Okay, and then Signe had her hand up.
Yeah, I was wondering how people kept their jewelry clean and polished in the earlier times. And also, by wearing the silver, does that have kind of a protective function to prevent it from getting so tarnished?
Definitely. By wearing it, I think you probably know from some of your own jewelry that the pieces that you wear most tend to stay looking cleaner and shinier. And so that certainly holds true for the old days, is that the pieces that were worn most often were just naturally less tarnished because they would be handled or they would be pinned on and off. But I do know that it was part of the kind of dressing process when you would get ready for church or for some other special occasion, that one of the things that you would do is sort of buff up your pieces. And you might do that even just with a piece of cloth. I think perhaps the pieces in the past were never quite as shiny as we're able to get them, because I think people were using just plain cloth to polish them up. There weren't the buffing compounds that you could get into the cloth itself. So, but still, wearing it definitely helps keep things shiny. But on the flip side, the oils in your hands, when left on the pieces, can kind of leave them dirtier and more tarnished over time. So there's kind of a delicate balance between wearing them to keep them clean and not wearing them to keep them clean.
And did they store them like wrapped in cloth, or, pieces that weren't used every day? Would they try to keep them cleaner by wrapping them in cloth pieces, or how would they store them?
I'm not quite sure. I know that there are some wooden boxes that would hold the pieces eventually. If you've seen some of the Ovaltine boxes that are multiple layers, sometimes those were used for jewelry. And I don't know if they just put them in, or if they were individually wrapped, or if there were some other things that they used to hope to keep them cleaner longer. That's a great question. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer.
Marilyn?
Hi. Yeah, my grandma, when she came, was, I believe it was someplace between 1890 and 1900. And she would go back almost every year. So she must have picked up some of these Sulias that I have different times over there. But got several. It's fun to hear this. I didn't know a lot of this information, so it's been really interesting.
Oh, Charlotte.
Yep.
Thank you for sharing all those lovely pieces with us.
Oh, well, it was so much fun to hear about them, Laurann. Thank you so much for doing that and covering those. I just wanted to mention that all the pieces I got from my grandmother, who was named after Pauline, so her name was also Pauline Fieldy, and I believe, I mean, the stories that I heard from her were that her father, Herman Fieldy, bought them in Norway when he would go back to Norway. Although some of them could also be from her, either, possibly her mother or her, even her aunt Pauline. It's possible, so I don't know. But they were definitely in the family. I tried to sort of find the ones that looked the oldest to sort of see what you might be able to tell me about them. And the one with all the stamps on it, that was so interesting. Thank you so much for giving us insight on what all those meant. And
Oh, sure.
yeah, so.
And the styles fit the West Coast. Your family had come from Ålesund in
That's right.
Sundbyberg.
Yeah.
And the West Coast brooch and also the bridal pendant are very much either West Coast or Sundbyberg styles. So that fits with having at least come from there, whether they were family pieces originally or something that Herman had acquired. They're definitely from that area.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Well, I'll ask my question. Since Norway had silver, was there much of an export market?
I suspect they were probably exporting some of the raw material. I don't quite know, but the mines were owned by Germans. And so I think probably they were mining for profit and the silver was leaving the country. I don't think there's been a huge export of Norwegian jewelry until more recent years when it's been able to be, again, I don't really want to say mass produced or manufactured. There's so much more handwork involved, but at least the times when it wasn't made one piece by one piece quite so much. So that makes a Norwegian silver jewelry, I think, even more special, as it has remained in the context where it developed, and it's got so many layers of meaning to us. It represents beauty and tradition in Norway and our own heritage. And so it makes it, I think, a little bit even more special that it hasn't been sent around the world quite as long.
Great, thank you. I think, is there anybody else who has a comment or a question?
Jill has a question.
Okay, and then Jean does too. Good. Jill?
Hi, I had a question because I have a little silver piece that has like an inlaid deer scene in it. I don't know if you can see too well, but
okay.
It doesn't have any mark on the back, but I'm just wondering even if that's Norwegian or if it was something maybe a guy would wear. And then this one also is kind of different. And it has the mark on the back. It says NARI 925. So I was just wondering if those are, this one definitely looks more Norwegian, but this one with the little deer and I thought was kind of unique.
Yeah, I'm not sure. That one, it has a sort of German feel to me, but whether that's just because it's sort of a hunt scene or that it's not Norwegian. The motif on the edge looks a little bit Norwegian. The one that you showed with the single ring in the center, that's a great piece. I'm glad you showed that because I didn't show very much for Sami jewelry, and that's a Sami design. Originally, they were smaller and they were meant to be like an eyelet for attachment or a decoration on it, something. And now they're making them into pins just for a little bit larger, and that's very nice. But it's specific to the Sami in the north, and also something unique perhaps to the Sami jewelry is the use of the letter M, which is what you have kind of underneath the crown, which I believe harkens back to Catholic times of, Ave Maria and Maria. And then there's also a few other initials that are used, and I can't right now remember. I think an A is one of them for Maria also. And so that's a little bit different for the Sami jewelry, that there are these letters, somewhat stylized, but as part of the jewelry, and that's specific to the Sami use. As I mentioned, it was a lot of the early Sami jewelry was made in Bergen, but yet now today there are lots of goldsmiths and silversmiths working in the north. And it could be NARI refers to one of those firms. There's a very large firm in Kautokeino. There's another firm in Tana that make not only contemporary styles, but some of these traditional ones as well.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Jean?
Yes, I have two. I have this piece. It's on a chain that I put it on a chain, but it has I can't figure out, I have to take a magnifying glass on it. I got it at a consignment shop in Trondheim. I like to go to those places. You can find some very interesting things at consignment shops. And this piece was my mother. It was with my mother's things when she passed away, and I have no idea. It doesn't have any markings, but it has the pin on the back, and it's had this placed on it. So I don't know. It has more of the markings that are in some of the old stavkirke, where it looks almost like the snake kind of thing on it. You know, the swirly stuff. There's one of the oldest stavkirke in the area of Sognefjord, far in Lusterfylke, has this on the door of the stavkirke. So, but I don't know where it's from. It has no marking.
Beautiful. That square pendant is so fun. It's an example of how any of these filigree elements can be rearranged in different ways. And so it's exciting to see that those things are so well suited for other shapes, not just circles. It's a nice piece. And sorry, going back to one of Jill's marks, which was the 925. 925 is sterling, and so, or closer to sterling. So you do see that mark as well. And so it might be that, Jean, one of your marks is on the square piece is either 925 or the 830.
Yeah, I think
quite possibly.
possibly 925. I was seeing 925, so I'll have to take a. But again, I thought it was very nice. It was in a consignment shop, and I just I was very, very happy to see it.
Well done. Some of you have done some really excellent shopping. Susan,
Yeah,
you also with the piece from Arizona.
Well, right now on gallery view, it's a few magnifying glasses and people studying the backs of their pieces. Yeah. It's kind of fun. Carol has hers out, Jill has hers out. Is there anything else? We have this wonderful resource here.
Anne has a question also. Anne Sather.
Oh, Anne?
Yeah, Tusen tak, Laurann. It was marvelous to hear more about my brooch and just the general history. I just wanted to ask a quick question. First of all, I was curious about the sølje that you are wearing. And secondly, I recently purchased this at a consignment shop. And
Beautiful.
It came with this tag that says, sorry, there it is. They're describing it as a wedding brooch.
Mm-hmm.
And it does have a little mark on the back. Sorry, I'm so I'll have to get out my magnifying glass, but I would think that this was a more modern version because it does have the standard pin.
Mm-hmm. I think so. And again, it's hard to know just how modern. You know, we can definitely say after 1900, but whether it was 2 years ago or 60, it's hard to say with those. But that one looks a little more substantial, the crown part, so that should be a nice wearable, easy to wear one.
Yeah. Okay.
You won't worry quite so much about it. Well, thanks for
and
asking.
How about yours?
My brooch is, I kind of consider this my work anniversary brooch. When I started working here in 1991, after I'd worked here 3 months, I bought myself just a fairly small basic brooch from the museum store. And so this is my work anniversary month now, so it seemed very appropriate to put it on today for the program.
Tusen tak.
Yep.
Thank you.
Last call,
Carol Tierney has a question.
Carol. And
It's really not I don't really have a question, because when my house was sold, some of my jewelry and my own Sulia and my mother's got sold in that sale, and I feel really sick and sad about that. But a couple people have given me Sulia since, but I was so happy. My daughter Erin was married at the age of 23, and she wanted a Sulia because she wanted to claim her Norwegian part. Otherwise, she was always happy to be Irish and English from her dad. But anyhow, she designed her wedding dress, which was beautiful. And I had a friend made it. And with that, the Sulia, I bought it at Ingebrigtson's, a nice dangling one. It was just beautiful. So it was, she still has it. She moved then to England, and she's been living there for 26 years, I think it is right now. So, but she still has her Sulia. She's happy and proud of that.
Oh, wonderful. And you should have her look around in England for Sulia.
Yes, I should.
We've certainly seen one example of one that had come into England, and I've heard from other people that whether it's tourism or what it is, there are often them, you can find them in antique shops and other sales.
Marilyn?
Yes, I'm so happy I tuned in today because I didn't even know about this program, and it's just been really interesting and helped me determine more probably where they came from. But my grandma, like I said, had been going over there almost every year when she first came, and I think she came in either 1896 or one, 1900, someplace in there. But anyway, she went several times and did get more Sulias there that were newer, and one of them was the one with the crown.
Yeah.
So
well, I think we should let Laurann have the rest of her Saturday, but I think we're so fortunate to have Vesterheim so close to us, which I would highly recommend a visit. And thank Laurann. We can all clap for her. You can unmute and clap because I think it was most enjoyable. I learned so much. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you so